Hello and welcome. You're watching Business Today TV. I'm Sakshi Batra. Well, there is good news coming in an otherwise very somber market right now. The gloomy picture that you're seeing in the stock market world, the gold prices, or whether you talk about the business sentiments right now, or the economic growth picture that we are seeing all across, there's some bright spot coming in. We are seeing that Aon's India 28th annual salary increase survey has found out that perhaps in India, there could be double-digit salary increases, which could be back in the country. It also finds that India is expected to see a salary increase by almost 10.4% in 2023. Joining in to discuss more on this, I have Mr. Jang Bahadur Singh joining right in. He's the Director at Human Capital Solutions at Aon India. Welcome, and thank you so much for taking the time out, Mr. Singh.
Thank you for having me on the show, Sakshi. It's a real pleasure for me.
Absolutely. The pleasure is ours, and you bring in the good news for us. So help us with some of those highlights that give you the confidence that in an otherwise, weaker sentiment kind of market that we are in right now, when everybody is talking about perhaps, a recession coming in globally in the developed markets in 2023, your survey actually indicates that back home, salaries would actually increase. That could be a complete contrast and a happy news for, people back home in India.
No, absolutely. I think you've already spoken about the headwinds, actually, and that's a fact that remains, be it around volatility or be it around geopolitical uncertainty. But the fact of the matter is that majority of the the number that we see is also backed up by some very strong tailwinds, which is one that if we look at the Indian corporate India today, one is that there is a fair amount of the corporate sector which is actually decoupled from the global economy. Now, I'm essentially talking about the more traditional sectors like hospitality, real estate, manufacturing, auto. And all of us have seen how demand is picking up, especially in the rural segment. Flights are absolutely full. People are talking about revenge travel, revenge buying. So there's a very, very strong sentiment that is being driven by the homegrown consumer. The second piece is that while, yes, if we look at these headwinds in the US and the other Western economies, they are likely to have an impact on our IT and ITES sector.
Okay.
But the demand for these sectors, for digital talent, for those services still remains strong. So what we're essentially observing is that, yes, as compared to 2022, the overall number for India comes down from 10.6% to 10.4%. And a lot of that downward trend is also being experienced in these sectors. Having said that, there are still very real, from an input side perspective, the war for talent is still raging on. It has only probably moderated to a degree. It hasn't really subsided. And in such an environment where everyone is going after digital talent, in India, what we've realized is that it's a very demand supply driven metric when we look at salary increases. And these are some of the factors that are contributing to a absolute number that continues to be among one of the highest in the last 5-6 years. Whereas if we look at it from a year-on-year perspective, maybe yes, from 2022, there's a slight moderation back to down to 10.4%.
Okay, so double-digit salary increase, that's a positive. It's slightly moderated from the previous year. It could moderate in the year 2023, and that could be because of the global headwinds that we are facing right now. But when you talk about, perhaps some of the sectors you mentioned, IT, which is not seeing some good days right now. It's facing a lot of pressure because of the kind of slowdown that we are seeing in US, which is their largest client. But which are the sectors that you expect to give these maximum or highest salary increases, going forward from here?
Yeah. So interestingly, while there is a downturn in sentiment in the IT sector, if we actually look at the top five sectors from an overall absolute number perspective, that actually continue to be these similar ones. So we are looking at e-commerce, we are looking at high tech, we are interestingly looking at professional services. But one segment probably which will be the silver lining in all of this would be the ITES, which is essentially the outsourcing business in India. Because the moment there's a bit of downturn and margin pressures hit the developed world, they look for cost arbitrage options, and that is when the India market becomes very, very lucrative for them. So if we look at it while, like you said, there are strong movements, but it's not as if the IT sector is going to suddenly start seeing lower hikes and employees will start to feel the pinch. I think what's really happening happening in this segment is that top line continues to increase. And at the same time, if you hear any of the recent results reports where CXOs of these IT services firms have talked about, it's the margin really coming under pressure because input costs also continue to be high.
Yes.
This talent is getting targeted across. There's a lot of convergence today, manufacturing, auto, FMCG, everyone wants tech talent. So it's not as if that they can afford to have lower increases, especially in this segment.
Right. What about if I have to ask you about the gap between the senior and the junior management and the salary hikes that could be expected in that? We've always seen a huge gap right here. Would it maintain? Will it narrow down? What are your findings?
Right. So I think interestingly, what has happened over the last few years is that the CXO layer in India, we need to probably take a different lens when we're talking about them. Now, looking at the valuations that these companies today have, and at the same time, the markets that they operate in, they are essentially they're like any other global company. No longer they are their core business, while may have set up in India, but essentially they are global companies. So if we look at the top management salaries, CXO salaries, as compared to their counterparts in Western economy, there's actually a discount. So while yes, if we compare it to someone who's just starting out afresh from campus in India, that gap is expected to widen. But when you is expected to widen, but when you compare their salaries to their CXO counterparts in other geographies and you convert INR into dollar, they're actually far lagging behind. So which is where if we change our perspective to look at them as global companies and global CXOs, then there's a different story out there.
Right, absolutely. Now, you did point out about, how the war for talent may continue, although it has moderated from the time that we saw last year. But there has also been an increasing worry on account of attrition, especially when we talk about the IT sector. And some of the new startup companies and even e-commerce companies, we are now constantly hearing about big numbers being slashed right there. Talk to us about it as to what do you expect on the attrition trends going forward from here?
Sure. So I think I'll just break down your question into two halves. If we look at the overall attrition, which is India Inc. attrition, in 2021, I think we had the highest attrition for over 2 decades. Our survey reported a number of 21%. YTD, that number has come down slightly to 20.3%. The primary drivers, though, for this attrition were around demand-supply imbalance, especially for niche and digital skills. And that continues to be the case. So if you think about it, the sectors which have the highest increase, sectors which are also facing the highest, are also the sectors that are facing the highest attrition. And a lot of it is because everyone wants to fast track their digital journeys, build their digital capabilities, and which is what is driving attrition. Having said that, specifically when we look at startups and when we look at e-commerce, there the story is slightly nuanced. There are segments where we have unfortunately seen some layoffs, we have seen some retrenchment happen, and that's the involuntary attrition. But if you then again double click, those are not jobs where we have seen their core or their niche talent really getting laid off. It's generally people who are on more support or more ancillary jobs. Unfortunately, those jobs are the ones that have seen most of this attrition. And then the second trend that we are observing more and more is that in 2021, given the volume of investment in startups in this sector, there were a lot of people who were not quote unquote startup native talent that had entered this segment. Probably to make a quick buck, probably to experiment, and so on and so forth. Now, with the entire funding winter, as some are calling it, hitting some of these startups, we are seeing those people who are probably not as big risk takers as a startup kind of an environment demands. Now, those people are looking at joining back organizations which are slightly more stable and their risk appetite is diminished. So there is absolutely some layoffs that have happened, especially in very consumer heavy dependent startups or which for a lot of experimentation. And second, we are seeing a return to more traditional organizations from individuals who had entered this space to experiment, try out, probably make a quick buck, one never knows. But I think definitely there's a move backwards towards more traditional stable environments by these individuals who for whom this journey hasn't quite worked out.
Right. And what about pay performance? I mean, what are the trends that you're looking at in that category, especially because that's something that most of the employers really look forward to understanding how will the, trend shape up going forward from here?
Sure. So I think there is good news there. With a higher budget means that if you're one of the top performers in a firm, there's more investment also happening. So
Yes.
the biggest trend that we've seen is that top performers today will end up in excess of getting in excess of 15% on an average, as compared to about 13.5% in the previous year. The other piece that we are seeing is probably because of so much of talent exchange, where roughly on an average 20-30% of an organization refreshed getting in new
Yeah.
hires, and typically new hires join in cycle mid of the year, and they are probably not eligible for the full cycle. So we are seeing a bit of a bulge in terms of the percentage of employees getting rated as meets expectation. But I
Right.
think the most interesting part is that organizations are really sharpening their response to performance indicators. So while we've spoken about the top performers, in other pieces that if we look at individuals that probably not met the bar set, investment in those pockets is coming down significantly. So in
Okay.
2020, that investment was on an average around 3 to 4%. That has come down to 2.5% in 2023. So organizations, what they're saying is that if you're a top performer, we are willing to go extra mile, invest. At the same
Yes.
time, if you're not meeting the bars set by the organization, then investment will really, really slow down.
Right, absolutely. Also, right in the end, I also wanted to, because, the topic that is right now the hot topic of debate, and that is moonlighting. I wanted to understand from you and your expertise on the subject as well. When you're in your discussions with the employers from various
Mhm.
sectors right here, since this topic has become a topic of big discussion, especially started off with the IT sector. It may be happening in the other sectors. It's not in the news right now, but the kind of discussions that are going around, your thought process about it, what are the employers thinking, and what are the employees saying, that why do they really need to think of moonlighting at this point in time?
Sure, and I think you rightly said moonlighting is a very, very hotly contested topic today. But I don't think we can think of this with a single-minded approach, with a cookie-cutter approach. It's almost different strokes to different people. So if we look at, say, a typical service environment, and that could be professional services, that could be IT services, any kind of a service environment, uh, almost all organizations get into a legal contract with their end client. And some of these legal contracts have very, very specific clauses related to who works on these projects, what is the data privacy, involvement of third party players, and so on and so forth. So obviously, there is a very, very strong legal argument that has to be made for or against in a services kind of a setup, which I'm sure our friends in the legal fraternity are looking at
Yes.
in detail. On the other hand, when I look at product firms, and one of few of the firms that have come out and announced that they are okay with moonlighting, these are firms which are essentially are not services firm. They create their own IP in-house, and essentially jobs are also designed that way. And of course, if we double click some of those, they also talk about that you cannot work for competition and so on and so forth. So I think there's a very, very, before one can jump to any conclusions, a very, very important need to look at it from a fine, detailed eye from a legal perspective. But I think what I can probably foresee and comment on is that we've spoken about how attrition is such a huge challenge.
Yes.
And across the board, be it early stage IT services,
Sure.
if one is to bring in more regulations in the workplace, and it could be moonlighting, it could be similar any of these return to work related stuff, my sense is in the short term it might mean some attrition in the firm, because individuals are already probably in some cases exploiting it, and probably some cases enjoying it. But if one were to bring in strong policies against it, at least in the short term, it could mean more attrition. So any step that we take, the firm will have to look at all aspects, legality of the entire piece, and also what is the impact it will have on employee morale. And downstream, certainly, I feel that if strong policy comes in, at least there'll be a small spike in attrition.
Okay, understood that and taken that note as well. Thank you so much, Mr. Singh, for being with us and sharing all the insights from your survey. Well, there's definitely bright spot and good news coming in as far as double-digit salary hikes are concerned, which boost the confidence of employers and employees both. Going forward from here in an otherwise very gloomy and somber market moods that we are seeing right now. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
If you like the video, do like, comment, share and subscribe.